Hello, and thank you for joining us today. Antonio and myself are going to speak to you today about the new treatments for Pompe disease under an early access to medicine scheme available in the UK. Some of you may know us both. Antonio is a clinical pharmacist, and I'm one of the two consultants in the lysosomal storage disorders service at Queen Elizabeth Hospital, Birmingham, looking after adult patients with Pompe. So in this talk, we're going to cover the two new treatments, starting by telling you a little bit about the research process that goes on before treatments are made available to patients. Then we're going to talk about the early access to medicine schemes with a particular focus on cypoglucosidase alpha, which is the one that we've had experience with treating patients with already at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. Antonio is going to talk you through some of the practical aspects of cypoglucosidase alpha and some of the trial outcomes compared with Myosin, and then we'll just finish with a quick summary. So what happens before treatments are ever available for patient use? So for every treatment, it begins with the early drug discovery phase, which usually happens in university or in a pharmaceutical company, where someone has a bright idea that for a product that may help patients or a particular disorder, and they may test their concept initially with testing it on cell lines in a laboratory, and then move on to testing it in animals usually. And at this stage, they are mainly testing proof of concept, but if proof of concept is successful, they'll also be looking at its safety. So how animals survive and thrive with the treatment. For obvious reasons, that's the single most important thing to consider when considering giving it to patients next. And after this phase, they will then think about some clinical outcomes that can be measured in animals that may be relevant to humans. So, for example, they may look at how active the animals are, or how well they feed, or how well they grow. And at this preclinical stage, if the drug appears to be safe and it appears to be effective and is doing what they expect it to do from their original concept for it, then they will move on to the clinical development. And this, for obvious reason, involves humans, testing it in humans. For most drugs, the first phase, phase 1, is tested in healthy volunteers, and by that is meant volunteers, people without the disorder or disease for which the drug is intended to treat. And the volunteers are usually paid to take part in this study. In some cases, for example, in oncology, so cancer treatments, where the treatment might be quite toxic, they do occasionally use patients for this phase, but for the most part, they'll use people without the disorder who are paid to take part. If the drug proves to be safe in at this phase, and that's all they can really look at, is its safety at this phase, the trial then moves on to phase 2. So phase 2 is the earliest phase at which we as health professionals can offer it to patients. And it's usually at this phase a very small group of patients, and particularly small in rare diseases. We'll move the trial through the phase 2, looking at both safety and its effectiveness in treating the disorder for which it's intended. And if it looks to be safe, with a low risk of side effects and effective, then the trial moves on to phase 3. And phase 3 is the stage at which many more patients with the disorder in question are recruited into the trial. And that's the phase that the 2 treatments that we're going to speak about is in. It's in a late phase 3 extension phase. Usually at some point in phase 3, the clinical outcomes start to be collated and reported, and if the drugs company, the pharmaceutical company developing the drug, think that the studies are looking promising, then they will submit that data for regulatory approval. So that's undertaken in the MHRA, so Medicines Health Regulatory Authority. But at the same time, if they're pretty confident they've got the next best thing for the disease or disorder they're hoping to treat, then they will apply to offer it as an early access to medicine scheme. So this is before it receives regulatory approval and well before it becomes available for routine prescribing on the NHS. And this is the phase that we're at with the 2 treatments we're going to talk to you about today. So if it gets approval to be offered as an early access to medicine scheme, it's the company that are developing the drug that are paying for it at this stage, but it's being delivered through the NHS clinics. So what does that mean for people with Pompe disease? These are the 3 early access to medicine schemes available in the NHS at the moment. And you'll see there that 2 of them are actually for Pompe disease. So one is the cipaglucosidase alpha that we're going to tell you a bit more about today. And the other one is avalglucosidase alpha, which is an alternative treatment that's being offered both for late onset Pompe and also infantile Pompe. And then there's another one there for severe atopic dermatitis that's not so relevant to this talk. Cipaglucosidase alpha with miglustat early access to medicine scheme. In November 2019, it was considered to be a promising, innovative medicine. So this was the point at which the early trial data was being collated and looking promising. Of course, then shortly afterwards, COVID hit and everything got delayed a little bit. But middle of last year, it was given the label of a positive scientific opinion. So that's a really promising phase for a drug development, because that means that at that point it can be offered as an early access to medicine scheme. And very shortly after that, that is indeed what happened. So we got a circular from NHS England, as did all our colleagues looking after Pompe patients elsewhere in England. And NHS England Specialised Commissioning Service advised us that the EAMS scheme was going to be opened up in all the LSD centres. So a month after that, we went to our local hospital medicines management team and we said, look, we've got these new treatments. They're going to be offered under an early access to medicine scheme. That means the company's going to pay for them, so you won't have to. They're looking very promising, and we'd like to offer them to our patients now, if that's okay. And usually, as long as not too much money's involved, our medicines management team will say yes, which they did. And at that point, then that gave us the green light to get the process in place to make it available to our patients with Pompe. The next phase in early September was to get an agreement drawn up between our hospital and Amicus, who produce cipaglucosidase alpha, and that allowed us to receive deliveries of the medication. And at the end of November, our first patient received the medication under the EAMS scheme. So at this point, I think I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Antonio, who I may say did produce these slides. So I give him all the credit for that. Thank you for listening. Antonio is going to tell you a bit more about the treatments with cipaglucosidase alpha and miglustat under the EAMS scheme. Thank you, Antonio.
Thank you very much. So the treatment under the early access to medicine scheme, it's the drug is unlicensed until the MHRA grants the marketing authorization. When they grant the marketing authorization, that means that it can be commercialized and prescribed by any doctor. So at that point, up until that point, it's classified as unlicensed. Because it's unlicensed, it will require to be administered by a nurse until that moment, and we are required to do the first infusions in the hospital. Each center will have their own protocol, so there might be a difference in the number of infusions patients have to receive in hospital, depending on their local centers. The eligibility criteria for patients under the early access scheme is very simple. Those patients with late onset Pompe will have to be on Myosin for 2 years or more. For those patients who have infantile onset, that requirement is reduced to 6 months, but this is only available for glucosidase alpha, as cipaglucosidase alpha is only going to be licensed at the moment for late onset. The enrollment on the early access to medicine scheme is only open until the marketing authorization is granted. So patients can only switch or enroll to be switched whilst the drug is not licensed. Once it's licensed, the early access scheme closes automatically and we are not able to switch any more patients. The treatment will continue under the EAMS until the National Institute for Clinical Healthcare and Excellence produces the approval. So NICE will be assessing the new treatment and it will be deciding whether the NHS should be paying for it. Whilst that's happening, the patients who had enrolled in the EAMS continue to receive treatment, but no new patients can enroll. If NICE finally approves the treatment, the patients for whom NICE has approved it will have access to it. This is important because sometimes NICE only approves treatment for a certain group of patients, not all of those that will be covered under the marketing authorization. So NICE can be restricted on which patients will receive treatment with a new medication. Those patients who were already on the early access will continue to receive treatment, and regardless of the decision of NICE, if they will continue if the company has agreed to provide treatment afterwards. And some of those patients who have been enrolled in the EAMS might not meet the NICE criteria, but they will be allowed to continue to receive treatment if NICE is restricted. I think I've been baffling there a bit more, but going into the early access scheme kind of guarantees that if NICE approve it, you will continue receiving treatment, even if you are not in the group of patients that think it should be given to. So this is how they look like. The miglustat comes in a 65 milligram capsule. You can see on the left of the screen. The important thing, the enzyme glucosidase alpha, comes in those vials that you can see in the center in a box with 4 at the moment. As it is unlicensed, that's how they look. The final product, once it's commercialized, will look much different than that. So just keep that in mind. Some practical aspect. The infusion time and the dose is similar to Myosin. Miglustat has to be taken on an empty stomach. This means you have to not eat anything 2 hours before taking miglustat, and you cannot eat anything for 2 hours after you've taken miglustat. And miglustat has to be taken 1 hour before we start the glucosidase infusion. So those can be a bit confusing. So not to eat anything for 2 hours before taking miglustat. Then once you take the miglustat, you start the infusion of glucosidase 1 hour after, and 1 hour after this infusion start, which it will be 2 hours after taking miglustat, you can eat something. The first few infusions, as I said before, will have to take place in the hospital. So check with your local team how many they will be requiring you to attend. Just a note on miglustat. It's a drug that has already been approved and has uses for patients with Gaucher disease and Niemann-Pick type C. Those are also lysosomal storage disorders like Pompe. It's taken orally, even for those other conditions. And the main reason it's been given for patients with Pompe disease taking glucosidase is because it helps stabilizing glucosidase and enables it to reach the lysosomes in a higher quantity than if it were just glucosidase on its own. So we're trying to get as much enzyme into the lysosomes as possible, and miglustat is helping us with that. So this was our first patient. As you can see, Keith there was very happy. He's surrounded by our nurses, Sarah and Anna, who were delivering the infusion, and I was there just to steal some of the fame and glory. It was the first patient in the country to receive the treatment after he had been in clinical trials, so the first patient receiving the EAMS, and he was very happy for us to take the picture and to share it with you today. As you can see, we were more than happy for him to be the first one. It was an excellent day for him and for us. Comparing glucosidase with Myosin, the dose is the same, 20 milligrams per kilogram. It took about 4 hours to complete the infusion as with Myosin. They both go in saline in a 500 ml usually. The first main difference we find is that it's being produced in a bigger vial, 105 milligrams rather than 50. That means it takes less time to prepare the infusion because we use a smaller amount of vials than with Myosin. The problem is we're going to need a nurse to deliver the whole infusion at home, whereas with Myosin, patients can self-administered or be semi-independent in their administration, so they don't require the nurse with them all the time. And with glucosidase, as I said, you have to take miglustat 1 hour before the infusion with an empty stomach, so not eating before 2 hours before and after. In terms of the trial outcomes, the main point we wanted to show is that it improves the 6-minute walk test compared to Myosin, and it had similar side effect profile as with Myosin, so it wasn't worse. Just to summarize, the early access to medicine scheme is done under the regulatory supervision. It's only open to patients only until the marketing authorization, and it can be offered to patients that have been receiving Myosin for longer than 2 years, or in the case of infantile Pompe for more than 6 months for avalglucosidase alpha. The first infusions will have to happen in hospital. It has a similar dose and infusion times as Myosin, and there's a similar side effect profile to Myosin. Thank you very much for your attention and for inviting us to present here today. Thank you.
Thank you from me too.